Well, I think it's achieved different things in different contexts, but in the United States, I think what became really clear is that it really changed the conversation. If we look at what the national conversation in the United States was before Occupy Wall Street, it was all about the budget crisis and austerity and so-called entitlement cuts, and basically passing on the bill for the economic crisis that had been created by the elites, by the 1%, to the people who did least to create that crisis and are most vulnerable to its effects. And it was really like a dam breaking when Occupy came on the scene, and there was something about the framing of "we are the 99% that opened up a space to talk about inequality. And I think that because it was a moral discussion, it was really a discussion about values. There was, I think, some shame that was brought to the idea of passing on the bill for the crisis. And that's one of the things that I find so sort of interesting and inspiring about being in Liberty Plaza / Zuccotti Park was the conversation that was going on, often a silent conversation between the occupiers holding their signs and the bankers walking by, where it was really, an appeal to values, and in some cases an attempt to try to bring a sense of shame to acting without principle, to acting based on greed, to acting as if people don't matter and as if there are no consequences to your actions. And I think that the collapse of the so-called super committee that was tasked with coming up with a list of cuts and budget cuts, it can in part be credited to Occupy. I've been involved in the anti-Keystone fight since the beginning, and we were very clear that that when the Occupy movement arrived on the scene, really putting corporate corruption front and center, really putting the spotlight on the nexus between corporate power and political power, the buying off of politicians, that really helped us in the Keystone fight, because it became more and more a discussion of this relationship between the Obama administration and TransCanada and all of the insider dealings and way too cozy relationships that informed the environmental review, that informed the entire process. And I think it became harder for the Obama administration to do what they were clearly intending to do, which was to rubber stamp the Keystone XL pipeline. I mean, this company was so sure that they were going to get a rubber stamp that they went ahead and bought the pipe, that they went ahead and mowed the lawn, that mowed the fields to lay that pipe before they had a permit, that they went ahead and bullied ranchers up and down the pipeline route, telling them that they were going to use eminent domain against them before they had the permit. So they had reason to believe that they were going to win, and they didn't win. I mean, we haven't won either. Right now it's a standoff and the thing is on ice. But I'm not so sure we would have won what we did win, which was a one-year reprieve and Obama feeling that he couldn't rubber stamp this in an election year without Occupy Wall Street. So, even though no to Keystone XL wasn't a demand of Occupy Wall Street, what you're seeing is that the context and the changing of the conversation has created space for people who do have clear demands to potentially win some of those demands in ways that we didn't imagine were possible several months ago. I think it is a movement that is, going at the underlying values of the culture. It isn't just, I mean, there is a huge amount of interest in policy and reinstating Glass-Steagall and in reining in the banks and getting corporations out of politics and in stripping corporations of their personhood. All of that is there. But deeper than that is a challenge to the underlying values that are governing society, and challenging a greed-based culture and a hyper-individualist culture. And part of that challenge, the flip side of the attempt to sort of shame the bankers, has been embodying another way to relate to one another. Well, I think the start of Occupy was a cry of rage at inequality, at corporate abuse, at just the outrageousness of the fact that a crisis that was created by the elites is being passed on to the most vulnerable, at the incredible double standards of the fact that the people who least need a bailout are the ones who get a bailout, and the people who need it most are confronted with the hardest hearts. And that's what brought people together. But in the ways that people have come together, there has been this attempt to try to build the society that we want in miniature. And that's been true of all the occupations, where there has been that element. In New York, which is where I spend the most time. I mean, you have the fact that people are being fed and that there's free health care, but also that the way the kitchen is being run is with a gray water system, and compost and organic food that's coming from local farms, to the extent that they were able to do that. Interestingly, there was a move within the park to move from petroleum-based generators to bicycle generators, and that was starting to happen. Then the police came in and just took the petroleum generators. So then I think 14 bicycle generators were built. So there was an ecological consciousness to that occupation, sort of built into it, despite the fact that climate change and the big sort of ecological issues were a bit of an afterthought in the sort of official texts. But I think that as we inevitably have the discussion of, okay, this economic model has failed the vast majority of people on this planet, what is our alternative? What kind of economy will work for the majority of people, for everyone? What kind of economy is going to create full employment, work with dignity, is not going to foul our planet? Then what we see is that the solutions to the economic crisis are the same solutions that we need for the ecological crisis, because we aren't just facing an economic crisis. We are facing a profound ecological crisis that is intimately linked to the same greed-based economic model, growth-based economic model, a model that can't ever say enough or have enough, that has no brakes. I mean, this same mentality that trashes people, trashes the planet. And so what we're starting to see is discussions happening about occupying the food movement, occupying the food system, for instance, occupying the farms, occupying the rooftops for solar energy, and green co-ops. In fact, Occupy New York just passed a resolution to form their first green co-op, a printing press. So jobs are going to start to be created, on a small scale. But I mean, it isn't just about within, an encampment. It's that, I was part of the so-called anti-globalization movement, the movement that was not anti-globalization, but was anti-corporate and anti-capitalist, and challenging this economic model. And so we were having a discussion a decade ago about precisely the things that we're talking about now, about the corporate takeover of our lives and the attacks on public space and the increase in inequality, and all of these economic rules that sacrifice people and the planet in favor of economic growth. And at that, in North America, that movement kind of got blasted off the map after 9/11. It sort of splintered. But it didn't disappear. It didn't go away. And a lot of people who had been part of that movement kind of put their heads down and started building the alternatives locally. And that took many forms, but some of the forms it took was building an incredible food movement, all kinds of creative ways to relocalize economies, community-based energy. And so now, 10 years ago they used to say, well, we know what you're against, but what are you for? What's your alternative? And that was kind of a theoretical discussion. What is your alternative? It's sort of like, let's think about it and, write a little pamphlet. But now we've got 10 years of actual living alternatives to point to that actually have a track record, an incredible track record of job creation, of protecting communities from vulnerability, from the vulnerability to economic shocks. And so now, but yet it's a niche market. It isn't really getting at the core crisis of capitalism, whether ecological or economic. It's not enough. So sort of like we have these little showrooms and we can go, this can work, but it isn't working in the sense that it is not big enough, it isn't widespread enough to actually deal with the scale of the crisis that we're dealing with. We need much more. And so what I find exciting is this opposition movement coming together with these alternatives that have been developed, and these two strains braiding together, and this movement that has come to realize that it isn't enough just to build your little alternative in the corner. You actually need to confront power. And people realize it isn't enough just to confront power. We have to have alternatives. We can't just be against, we also have to be for. These strains are coming together, and that is, to me, the most exciting thing about this political moment. There is already an economic crisis, and it hasn't gone away. Things weren't so great before Wall Street crashed in 2008. It hasn't recovered. And what's going on in Europe right now is extremely precarious. And we have to be ready for another shock, a big one. What we're trying to do has never been done before. You look at Tahrir Square and the Arab Spring, and how amazingly inspiring that was. I mean, it was incredible, and it inspired this movement, as did other movements, as did the Spanish indignados and the Chilean students. But overthrowing a dictator is not the same as overthrowing neoliberalism, which is a absolutely decentralized, headless network that locks itself in and morphs and reaches into every aspect of our lives. And now that the Egyptians have overthrown Mubarak and have elections, now they have to learn how to overthrow neoliberalism, and that is really, really hard. So the truth is, we've never done this. I mean, we can learn from, we can look at countries in Latin America where there have been some progress made in moving away from neoliberal economic models, and they're far from perfect, but there are definitely lessons to learn about social mobilization and how you get out of neoliberal laws. I always think, about Evo Morales coming to power. One of the first interviews he gave was with the BBC. And he said, I'm a prisoner in the neoliberal palace. I'm a prisoner in the palace. I'm locked in with all of these neoliberal laws. And what's important to understand about that is that even when you have this historic election, when you have an indigenous leader brought to power by mass social movements, the first thing he says is, I don't have the power to do what I want to do, right? So I say this because I think it is so important for people to admit that they do not know how to do this, and that it is absolutely terrifying to go up against transnational capital and to think about how to rebuild on the scale that we're talking about. Because once you admit that you're actually scared and that you don't know, then it becomes clear that a lot of what you're doing is fear-based response. And when you're afraid, you go to something that's more familiar. And maybe that familiarity is just attacking the person next to you at a meeting because you know how to do that and you can win that fight. And maybe it's making a fetish of autonomism and saying, I'm never going to make a political demand in my entire life because I think that demands are oppressive. All of it just keeps us from actually doing what we're afraid of. So I think there's all kinds of different ways that we manifest that fear. I think it starts with admitting that nobody's done this before. It's totally terrifying. It's not just terrifying because nobody's done it before. It's terrifying because the force of the state comes down on you in very, very real ways when you do. So I say we admit that. Admit that we're going to express and manifest that fear in different and individual ways, some of which will be more obvious than others. Some of us will be better at disguising our fear than others. But I think it's a really important starting point. And if this is a fallow period, right? If this is the winter, and this is, I'm borrowing from some of my friends in New York, that we should use it, because capitalism is a crisis machine, and the next shock is coming, the next crisis is coming, and we're going to have to be really organized, and we're not going to have as much time for process, and education, and in-reach, as somebody said. We've got to do outreach, but we also have to do in-reach. Another phrase I learned when I was in New York recently. So if we have a moment now, we should use it to do that work, because it's coming.